Hi guys, and welcome to episode 4 of Behind the Frame. Today I'm going to be taking an image from Amboseli, where Mike is actually finishing up our Big Cats and Tuskers safari, and a destination that I really enjoy going to. And the reason that I've chosen this image is twofold. The one is because it has such potential, but often people look at these kind of scenes and are not quite sure how to get the most out of it. And the second thing is that it helps me to illustrate one of the reasons that I love photographing wildlife in Amboseli. So first of all, here's the image. If we have a look at some of the technical specs here, it was taken at ISO 200 at 400 mils. So I was shooting off the Canon 100 to 400 Mark II lens, a great versatile all-round wildlife lens. Shot at f7.1 and 12/50th of a second. So obviously with multiple subjects in the frame and being fairly far away from us, just giving myself a little bit of extra depth of field to make sure that there's depth and clarity to the scene. So having a look at this from an editing perspective, you've got to again ask yourself the question, what is it that you want to dial up and draw the viewer's attention to, and what are the potentially distracting elements in the frame? So as a starting point, before we go anywhere, I'm going to open up my crop tool, and these bushes, this short scrub in the foreground here, we can very easily get away with kind of removing some of that straight off the bat. So what I'm looking at here is just to decide how far I want to go up. Now I don't want to take away too much of the space here in the foreground, and just looking at this image, it gives enough space and gives you a sense of scale of the area. We've obviously got this kind of plume of dust, which we're going to address a little bit later, but now we've cut out some of that distracting element in the foreground. So that's pretty much where I'm going to leave that. Now looking around the edges of the frame, there's nothing really, no real points of contrast on the edge of the frame that concern me too much. Right, from an editing perspective, going on to the basic panel over here, we can see that our histogram sits fairly central. So we've got a little bit of room to play on the exposure side of things, as well as the whites. Rather than teasing out the whites only, I'm going to lift the exposure just a touch. So probably somewhere around there. Come down to the whites and try and tease out some of those areas over there. And already what you're going to see is that the image starts to just have a little bit more punch to it. The blacks as well, so if you have a look at the far left-hand side of the histogram, we're going to pull those down a little bit. I'm not too phased about going to the edges of the histogram now using whites and blacks, bearing in mind that we're going to use tonal contrast to stretch out that tone curve a little bit more down the line. Overall, we can lift clarity a touch in the scene. Vibrance, we're going to lift that up. We're going to take saturation. Remember, I said as a general import, we usually like to use a value of around 5. And what you can see is already we've got to a point where the colors and vibrance of the image are popping. Right, and coming down towards the tone curve, we're going to look at lifting the highlights. Now, if we play around with the highlights, you'll see that we're starting to work the dust and those blues in the background. And this is one of the things that I love about Amboseli, is that you've almost always got this kind of blue canvas to shoot against, with the foot slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro in the background. So I'm going to lift those highlights. I'm also going to lift the lights a little bit and just bring out a little bit more contrast in there. And not too much that needs to be done really on the darks and the shadows. We're just going to drop those just a touch. And you'll see that it's made the elephants, the darker areas around the elephants, just a little dark. So we'll address that just now. But you can see that if I switch these tone curve adjustments off, you can see how we've now started to bring out the presence of that dust. Right, going down to our detail, obviously sharpening and masking. We're going to mask out, and we only want the sharpest parts of this image. Now, there's not enough contrast and edge contrast for that dust to be picked up, but we're not looking to sharpen that in any case. So I'm happy to go to somewhere around here, and we're just going to increase that value up to about 57 or so, 50, let's go there. Right, so overall we've now done a global edit on this. I want to try and make the blues really pop out in this image a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the white balance, the color temperature here. And what you'll see is by dropping that down there, we've made the whole scene just a little bit cooler. And so those blues really pop and become a little bit more vibrant in the background. We can also go into our HSL panel and the hue, saturation, and luminance. And in the saturation sliders here, we can just increase the blues just a little bit in terms of the saturation. And you'll see that that again has just made that lovely blue background even more prominent. Now, from a localized and specialized adjustment brush perspective, what we want to do is really try and make this plume of dust a little bit more prominent and give that a little bit more presence in the frame. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a brush, and I'm going to go in with a very low flow, a value of 30 or so, and slowly just kind of work an effect across here. I'm going to zero the area that I'm all the effects, and I'm going to switch on O for overlay. And what I'm slowly going to start to do is just brush over these areas where we've got this lovely plume of dust. And obviously this is what drew our eye to the scene, is this herd walking towards the vehicle that we were based in and having this lovely plume of dust stretching up into the sky. So I'm just going to open up the brush a little bit there using my square brackets. You'll remember that from the last episode. And just going gently over these areas where there is a bit of dust. There's no finite edges with this plume of dust, so it can be quite tricky, but you don't want to go in and leave hard edges on anything around here. Just going to bring the brush down a little bit as we go around these areas around the ellies. And so what we're doing here is just selecting the areas that we want to try and increase the presence on. So with our selection complete now, and no real hotspots or areas that are going to look unnatural if we start to lift them, I'm going to switch our adjustment brush overlay off, and now we're going to apply the effect. And what we're wanting to do there is lift the whites and maybe just the exposure just a touch. So something along those lines. If I switch the localized adjustment brush off, you'll have a look and you can see that that dust really does now pop a little bit more. We can then go in and use a second brush, and you'll remember a little earlier on I said that the darker areas on these ellies perhaps look a little bit too dark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my overlay on again to show you guys, and again just using a soft brush, building up the effect, just go over these ellies a little bit, and we're just going to lift the exposure and clarity on them by a fraction, just to give them a little bit more presence in the scene. And so now that we've got that selection done, what we're going to do here is lift the shadow areas, just lift the exposure a touch, and we're going to then add a little bit of clarity into that. So going back and having a look at all of the adjustments, remember when we do localized adjustments with brushes, our goal is to try and pull our viewer's eye to an area in the frame that we want them to be locked into. So have a look without the adjustments and now with them. And so that plume of dust and the elephants just have a much greater presence in the frame after those adjustments. So I think that is pretty much it. The only last little thing here is to apply some lens corrections. So we'll allow the lens calibration settings to remove any chromatic aberration and distortion. And you can see there's actually quite a bit of distortion on this lens and vignetting as well around those edges. And so you can see now that we've got that, the distortion and the vignetting taken away, maybe we can add just again a subtle vignette. So we're going to go down to our effects panel. And again, I like to use a value of -8 there, bring in the midpoint a little bit, just a slight adjustment to that. And you'll see that that just darkens those areas and just gives the eddies a little bit more. So a pretty straightforward image with some localized adjustments. Again, everything that we do is aligned to not to change the content of the frame, but to dial up certain aspects and dial down others. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. As always, if you have any questions or suggestions for future features, do give me a shout and let me know.